Hello, welcome to Miss Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Miss Peepers. Let's talk about origins. Today we're discussing Marley by John Clinch. Marley is a prequel to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. In this novel, Clinch imagines what a young Jacob Marley and young Ebenezer Scrooge might have been like, how they met, how they built their business, and what kind of a relationship they truly had. Dickens leaves a lot of vagaries in his story because truly those details are not necessary for the fable that is A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol is focused, of course, on a wealthy man who has lived his life cruelly in pursuit of money, learning that there is a different way to live, that there is a more moral way to live, and that he can use his money to look after his fellow humans and thus build a much richer life for himself. But even in Dickens' novella, it's pretty clear that Scrooge was not always the hardened and greedy man that we see at the end of his life. In fact, when he was younger, he had hopes and dreams. He fell in love, he got engaged, and almost got married. And all of that went away. So Clinch gets into the details of why that might have happened. And he focuses on Jacob Marley, Scrooge's partner in the business, who by the time A Christmas Carol has begun is already dead. In fact, that is the first line of A Christmas Carol. Marley was dead to begin with. So Dickens never directly showed us Marley except through Marley's ghost. Now, not to spoil the end of my own video, but I really enjoyed this book and I highly recommend it for anyone who is interested in Dickensian literature. This book has that Victorian flair with a more modern writing style. So if you are interested in classics but find them intimidating, perhaps Marley and then A Christmas Carol would be a great introduction, because A Christmas Carol is also fairly easy to read. And if you don't believe me, I read it actually in a series of videos in December, which I will link to. And while that suggestion might upset some of the classics purists, I personally am of the belief that if you are interested in something but intimidated by it, one of the best things you can do is come at it from a different angle, come at it sideways, and you may find yourself hooked. Marley comes in just under 300 pages, and I think it has enough in it to make someone want to read more Victorian literature. At least that was the effect that it had on me. This is the year of David Copperfield, y'all. I'm doing it. In Marley, John Clinch shows just how much he loves and appreciates Dickens, not just A Christmas Carol, but Dickens' other works as well. There are a lot of direct references to A Christmas Carol, of course, a number of lines that he pulled straight from that story, but he also makes sideways references to other novels of Dickens. Marley, for example, in order to conduct his less legitimate business ventures, uses a number of aliases, all of which are pulled straight from Dickensian work. Something I found interesting about the approach of this novel is that while it is called Marley, and Marley is definitely the driving force of the story, he's not really the focus. How can I describe it? This takes a third-person narrative style, but a lot of the book is following actually Scrooge more so than Marley. It felt fairly even or possibly tipped in favor of Scrooge. And I think that's an interesting choice. I don't necessarily disagree with it, but it was something that I noticed, that we're getting Scrooge's story through the influence of Marley. And Marley is actually the one who, through his actions and through their interactions, turns Scrooge into the curmudgeonly old man that we meet in Dickens' story. And indeed, that's indicative of Jacob Marley's character. He is the deceitful one. He is the one who is seeking out business ventures, seeking out business partners, not all of whom are on the right side of the law, many of whom, in fact, are in that gray space between legality and morality. And Scrooge just cares about the money. And the influence of Belle, Scrooge's fiance and ultimately lost love, prompts him to pay attention to what his business partner is actually doing. And that leads us to the conflict in this book between what Scrooge is gaining from this business venture and what he is losing. This book is also quite relevant today if we think about how much wealth is hoarded. Scrooge and Marley both don't really do a whole lot with their money. They just hold on to it. So that image of Scrooge in A Christmas Carol of being able to afford coal for the fire, but only allowing one piece of coal per day because coal is expensive and why would you spend money on literally anything? That attitude is prevalent throughout this book in both Scrooge and Marley. Marley likes to live a more decadent lifestyle, but he also has rooms full of the spoils of this business, and it's all just kind of sitting there. And it makes one think of today's billionaires, the wealthy few who could do a lot of good, and some of whom are doing some good, but not nearly as much as they could do with their ridiculous amounts of money. Scrooge and Marley are much the same. One of the central points of contention in this book is that it's set in the mid-1800s. It starts before and ends after slavery has been made illegal in England. And so at the beginning of the book, Scrooge and Marley, the business, are involved in slave trading ships, which at the beginning of the novel is legal. Belle and her father point out that this is in fact incredibly immoral, a stance that Scrooge never really considered because he doesn't pay attention to the business end of things. He doesn't question it. It's making him money, so that's what matters to him. But when he realizes that the woman he loves objects to this on moral grounds, he also understands that if he wants to be with her, he's going to need to make some changes. And so he attempts to do so. Of course, we know from A Christmas Carol that they do not end up getting married. And I won't spoil for you quite how that happens in this book. There's more to it than just this particular business venture. But that is the catalyst that sends Scrooge into asking questions and getting more involved in the business side of their organization and not just focusing on the money, which has been his job. To Marley's dismay, Scrooge veers out of his lane and starts to ask uncomfortable questions, and the two become at odds. But this kind of argument that, well, it's not illegal, we're not doing anything illegal, is the sort of thing that we hear from major corporations, the sort of thing that we hear from very wealthy people who maybe exploit the fact that certain things that are legal in their country of origin, say the United States or Europe, are not illegal, or at least that are decriminalized in other countries. And therefore they do those things there because they technically can, even though they know full well that it's wrong. They don't care. So we have this company that does a bunch of different things, makes a lot of money, and doesn't do a whole lot of good in the world, if any. Any good that they are doing is more under duress. And even Scrooge pulling out of the slave trade before it's technically necessary by law is doing that not because he thinks that it's wrong per se, but because his fiance thinks that it's wrong. And he does it for her, which may sound romantic on some level, but is also quite disappointing because as soon as she's gone, he doesn't care anymore. It's not for her. It's lip service. It's performative. Sound familiar? We see this a lot in modern corporations. They will get involved in philanthropy, but it's a tax write-off. And it's very public. If I may steal a line from, I think it was To the Manor Born, where a wealthy character says, make a donation anonymously, but also make sure they know who it came from. So there's a lot to think about in this book, not just contemplating the past, but also considering how little things have changed. The technology has changed, the methods of operating have changed, but we are left with the possibility of A Christmas Carol in which Scrooge does ultimately see the error of his ways. We can only hope that all of our billionaires are visited by ghosts until they too decide to make a change. But perhaps I'm being a little too optimistic. So let me know, have you read Marley or anything else by John Clinch? He's written a couple of novels. This is the first one that I have read. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you don't feel chatty, that's fine. We can use an emoji. How about a ghost to represent the ghost of Jacob Marley? Either way, please keep reading, and I will see you in the next one. When you start booktube, nobody tells you what an arm workout holding these books up is.